perhaps the most prominent never Trumper. William Galston is a senior fellow at the Brookings Institution, has written books on political theory, most recently Anti-Pluralism, the Populist Threat to Liberal Democracy in 2018. He too served in the White House, but in 1993 to 95 under President Clinton. He writes a weekly column for the Wall Street Journal where one might say he is the House Democrat. And last, James Caesar, who will appear as a defender of Donald Trump. He is a professor of politics at the University of Virginia and director of the program there for constitutionalism and democracy. He's also a senior fellow at the Hoover Institution. And he's has written on American politics and on the American founding. His most famous book is Presidential Selection, written long ago in 1979, and most recently, Designing a Polity. And he has several books written on presidential elections. So those are our three speakers, and I turn it over now to William Kristol. Bill.
Well, thank you, Harvey, and it's a great pleasure to be on a panel with, even if it's only a virtual panel, with all three of you, and even if the chat function is disabled. So that's so harsh, Anna, you know. The relish with which you said that, I thought was a little inappropriate, you know. Some of us like the chat function, but not at Harvard, of course, where it's beneath the dignity of Harvard to have a chat function. Anyway, it's good to be on a panel with old friends, teachers. I've had conversations with Bill Kristol, with Bill Galston and Jim Caesar, and of course Harvey Mansfield. So all of which I highly recommend. So I've learned a lot from all three of you, and I expect to do so today as well. It would have been nice to have come back to Harvard for this function, which has been going since 1992, I think, with Bill Galston and me, and joined by Jim Caesar this year. One of the nice things about being there is, of course, you know, having dinner and talking beforehand and afterwards with so many old friends, acquaintances, opponents, critics. It would have been interesting to have been back this year, since some of the friends would have been critics and some of the opponents would have been friends. But I'll just imagine what that would have been like at the as we mixed and mingled over the barbecue and after the first session. So, but we need to come back to do it in reality at some point, and 2 years from now, or maybe we should even, if COVID is under control, maybe we could do it. We can do a special session a year from now, you know, even if there's no important elections next year, just a couple of state elections, there'll be a lot of interesting things going on. I'll just say I'll try to be pretty brief, actually, because I think we've all been following this so closely. I'm not sure that I know anything anyone else doesn't, or have even any thoughts anyone else doesn't have. But let me go through a few things about each party and about a little bit about Donald Trump. But let me just begin with these are pretty obvious statements, but worth just putting on the table to begin with, kind of the forest rather than the trees, perhaps. We live in a very partisan and polarized country. The election returns suggest that, and the repetition of the election returns from year to year suggests that. You know, it hasn't always been that way. There's been more variance between elections and more variance up and down the ticket at many times in the past, but other times when there was this something like maybe this kind of polarization and partisanship. Bill Galston may talk about this, was this a particular issue of concern to him. But again, the absence of split ticket voting, which I think we've both noticed several times in these panels, increasingly as we go through the last 2.5 decades, is very noticeable this time. You know, Tip O'Neill said all elections are local. I think you could almost say that these elections are pretty national. There are very few people who really stood up. If Trump carried your state and you were a Republican, you were very likely to win your state. Same with district. Susan Collins, there are a few exceptions, but not many. And you need to be someone like Susan Collins, who's been in office for 3 terms and has a really well-established brand, as they say in Maine, to stand up against the partisan tide. So it's partisan and polarized country. It's quite evenly divided I mean, it's again an obvious point, but it hasn't always been that way. It wasn't the political science, was he a political scientist or journalist Samuel Lubell, who famously had the sun and the moon. Typically in American politics, there's a major party and a minor party. This, I think, was kind of a New Deal, post-New Deal sort of formulation, and the minor party reacts to the major party. Occasionally wins the White House, Eisenhower for 8 years, occasionally wins Congress in an off year, but the major party sets the agenda, dominates the politics. Pretty hard to say that, I think, over the last 10, 20 years, where you have an evenly divided country. I think the 2016 House election, now this is going to be, I guess this will be filmed, and this is being filmed, and it'll be on the internet forever. So I'm going to caution that I have not fully checked every fact. So these need to be double checked before being put in people's, doctoral dissertations and stuff. But I believe the House, in the national House vote, which in a certain way is a good representation of where the country is. That is, just add up all the votes in all the House districts. There are a couple of glitchy things about that. A couple of people went unopposed, but basically it's a pretty good representation. It takes away the distortion of whoever the presidential candidates are, in a way. I believe the national House vote in 2016 was slightly Republican, like plus 1%, maybe not even a full percentage point. This year, it looks to me as if it's going to end up about plus 2% Democratic. So that's the whole swing from a Republican House to a Democratic House is 3 percentage points, not as big as it sometimes has been in other circumstances. The presidential vote, just to be simple about it, President Obama won by 4 points in 2012. Hillary Clinton won by 2 points in national popular vote in 2016. And it looks like Vice President Biden is going to win by about 4 points, almost identical probably to what he had in 2012 as the vice presidential nominee this time. So 4-2-4. So that's a pretty unusual non-variant stability, you might say, in the performance of the Democratic Party's candidates, and a pretty unusual stability, I'd say, at the House and Senate level. The places that weren't stable, I'll just say parenthetically, were obviously the off-year elections, where you had some big Republican waves, 2010, 2014, and a big Democratic wave in 2018. One of the biggest questions for this year was, would this year look like 2016 or 2018? Would it be a Democrat? 2018, I think the Democrats won the House national popular vote by about 8.5%. So would we have, and that's what a lot of the polling suggests, that's what I actually thought might happen. So if that had happened, you might say, okay, we're in a slightly different country now. We're in a Democratic +8, +9 country, which of course could vary then, but would be kind of the baseline. But one of the big lessons of this year, so I think, is, at least for now, we're not in that country. We're in a big turnout presidential election. Biden did better than Hillary Clinton, but we got back closer to 2016, and certainly with the Democrats losing a handful of House seats and picking up just one Senate seat, it looks like. The Republicans holding the Senate majority. Well, we'll see what happens in Georgia, but for now, at least, only picking up one Republican Senate seat. 2016 might be a better indicator of the future than 2018, or probably something in between them, but maybe closer to 2016. Two other quick points just on the big picture. Excuse me. Demography, I never liked the phrase or the clause or the statement, demography is destiny. It's sort of bad for those of us who like politics and political science, and want to think that, the regime and the forming and the choices we make, reflection and choice, are more important than just the matter of politics, so to speak. But matter matters, I guess, and the demography, the demographic factors. I mean, if you gave a competent election observer the race, the ethnicity, the age, and the education level, maybe I'm missing one or two things, of the citizens of a district or a state, he or she could predict pretty well how that vote is going to go. Again, that's always been sort of the case. Obviously, we've had big gaps in racial voting and regional voting and other, education and not so well educated, wealthy and not so wealthy. But it's more so this time than normal. Not much persuasion going on in our elections, much more mobilization or I don't know what the right word is, even just rallying to your flag and showing up to vote your party every 2 or 4 years. Now it's overstated the demography is destiny point. One of the key arguments, and I more or less agree with this argument that many people have made, Ron Brownstein, maybe the best known exponent of this, is the Democratic coalition is growing, the Republican coalition is shrinking, the coalition of the ascendant, which is younger voters, better educated voters, more minority voters, more diverse voters, and those are all increasing proportions of the population. And Republicans are hanging on to a smaller a share that's just whatever. You might like them or dislike them, but analytically, just empirically, is getting smaller each election cycle of older, white, less well-educated voters. But Trump had some appeal in certain minority groups. He's surprised with Hispanics and not just Cubans. If you look at some of the other data, and maybe Bill has looked at it more closely than I, Trump outperformed what certainly expectations, and I think even Hillary Clinton actually, with some Latino or Hispanic American voters, especially men. Among African Americans, Trump outperformed a little bit. Seems to have gotten 7 or 8% of the vote of African American women, but maybe 16, 17, 18%. These exit polls are a little hard to use at this point because they have to be fixed by being, correlated with the actual vote, so to speak. But yeah, he seems, there's a big gender gap among African Americans, bigger than proportionally than among white Americans. But in any case, so that demography isn't quite destiny, because one of the key demographic arguments has been, well, these minority groups' share of the electorate is going up, the non-white Americans' share is going up. But if it turns out that the Republicans can appeal to, for various reasons, to some chunk of that non-white electorate, it changes the calculus a little. And in fact, Florida, I was involved in various efforts against Donald Trump, and we thought Florida might be a better bet than some of the upper Midwest states because it was a more diverse state. And that turned out to be kind of the opposite almost of the way it worked out. I mean, these are all on the margin, obviously, 2, 3, 4%, but still, that's how these elections are being decided. And finally, not only is demography destiny, finally in this kind of big picture thing, but sociology, in a sense, you might say, is destiny. This is a different way of thinking about, that is to say, people's pre-political or not so political views seem to shape their political choices. And I'd say religious belief and kind of religious belief is probably key to that. Now, you could argue in some fancy way that's really a political view too, but leaving that aside for a minute, 27% in the exit polls of US white evangelical or born-again Christians, people who accepted either of those kind of terms. 27% of the US consists of such people, a little over a quarter. They went 3-1, 76-23, better than 3-1 for Trump. 73% of Americans aren't white evangelical or born-again Christians. Obviously, therefore, there are a lot of subgroups in there. They went 60-37 for Biden. That's a pretty massive difference, 76-23, 37-60. And the truth is, excuse me, the truth is, if you took out of that, of the 73% others, church-going Catholics and some other, I imagine, religious voters, that could really get yourself down, maybe took out, and here that's capturing also Black Christian voters, and got yourself down to, let's say, secular Americans, I bet the gap would be much greater. So the white Christian evangelical America and secular America are living in, to some degree, in two different universes, and that's very much reflected in their voting patterns. I'll get to Donald Trump in a minute and say a word about him. I don't want to dwell on him too much, but let me just saying at this level of sort of leaving aside Trump. The truth is, if you just take what I've said and sort of the big picture contours of American party politics today, and said to someone, political scientist who came down from Mars and said, Republican, it was 8 years of a Democratic president. He was pretty popular, got reelected with 51% of the vote. He wasn't like massively popular, pretty polarized country. The Republicans won the Congress in 2014, both houses. Economy was in good shape, but maybe not gangbusters. What do you think will happen in the next election, 2016? Well, the American public has a tendency to change parties after 8 years, though not too dramatically. So maybe it'll be a close election. Maybe the Republican will win. That would have been correct. Hillary Clinton won by 2 points in the popular vote. President Obama had won by 4. So there was a bit of a drop off. Trump ran the table on the Electoral College, drew an inside straight. Then if you told that political scientist, 2018, the economy's good, but he hasn't increased his appeal to anyone much. He remains a kind of 44% approval president. What do you think is going to happen? Probably would have said, well, he'd probably lose at least one of the 2 houses of Congress, or certainly lose a bunch of seats in the typical first term off-year election. That's what happened. If you had a little more granularity, you would say, but given the polarization, the Republicans would probably hold the red states more, and they did in the Senate, and therefore they held the Senate in 2018. And then you said to the political scientists, what about 2020? What do you think? There's going to be a pandemic, which won't be handled terribly well. There'll be a recession as a result of it. The president, our Republican president, won't have expanded the coalition much. The other party, the Democrats, will nominate a pretty acceptable candidate to the middle of the country. And the political scientists would probably say, well, this might be one of those occasions, doesn't happen that often, where an incumbent could lose, because it was such a close call anyway in 2016. He hasn't expanded the coalition. We're in a recession. Maybe this challenger will get a 4% edge over the incumbent. And in fact, that's what happened. So there's a certain weird way in which, for all that Trump has so dominated things, and I think legitimately so, I don't think this is just people going crazy about him, that it's an important question, the question of Donald Trump and what is to make of him, and what his after effects will be, and so forth. What his real effects are now, what his after effects will be. But in a certain way, one has to say also that one could give a reasonable analysis of a lot of the election returns without ever quite using the term Trump. And no one would, as I just said, be terribly surprised in a certain sense that we've ended up where we were, given where we began 4 or 5 years ago. Let me say a word about Trump quickly. People probably know my views about that. I mean, for me, the core fact, I'm sure people ask, why are you never Trump? And what about these policies and that? I mean, for me, he is a demagogue. He was a demagogue. Demagogues are dangerous. They will pose real dangers in a democracy to our institutions and norms. They're peculiarly dangerous in America if they become president, because we only have one president, and we've been pretty well spared real demagogues as president for quite a long time, I would say. I thought in 2016, he threatened to do great damage to institutions and norms. I think he did quite a lot of damage to them. He was checked in certain ways by people within his administration. There were certain guardrails. The institutions themselves, of course, checked him, and especially once the Democrats won the House. Still, those guardrails were diminishing, certainly from within, in the last couple of years of his first term. So for me, a second term would have been dangerous. I mean, worse than the first term. Ratification of what he had done. And people can say, well, it's only things he said. He didn't do most of them, but he tried to do some of them, and he was tempted to do them, and he would have done more of them if he'd been reelected, I believe. And you don't know, maybe you survive 8 years of a demagogue, just like we've probably survived 4. But I think at that point, the damage is very considerable. And I think the damage also to conservatism, to the Republican Party, was very great, has been very great already as well. And now, of course, we see it right now at the current moment, where he's going out challenging the election returns, but not just the normal, gee, I don't like this, maybe I can use a lawsuit to get a little advantage, but literally, don't stop the count, don't count the vote. Someone put it on Twitter, I think today, in 2000, the Republican position was, I think, a defensible one. Don't recount the vote. We've done enough after 4 weeks of counting. This is endless recounting to try to get a win for Gore. That's okay, fine. We can debate whether that was a good decision in 2000 and how disingenuous Republicans were being, but it wasn't. At some point, you do have to stop kind of endlessly recounting every possible questionable ballot. And there had been 4 weeks of it. Here, the literal Trump position is don't stop the count. I mean, no one's questioning that these are real ballots cast by real human beings according to the laws of their states. They can question a couple of them that came in late or that were cast allegedly, conceivably even after election day, though there hasn't been much time for them to cast them. But no one doubts that these were ballots mailed in or delivered by what the state law, what they were told to do by state authorities. These weren't ballots that were manufactured or stolen. And Trump's view is they shouldn't be counted. That's a pretty astonishing view for a president, for a party leader, for a nominee, for a candidate. More astonishing for a president. More astonishing still that it's been echoed by a fair number of Republican elected officials and conservative journalistic types. Now, to be fair, a lot of Republicans have also just kept quiet and tried to stay out of this. And maybe that's I'll get back to that in a way that raises the question of where the party goes after Trump. And in a way, that's a little bit of a snapshot right away. Does the party just sound okay, Trump wants us to stop counting the vote. Let's encourage people to take to the streets, to have slightly violent demonstrations, not too violent so far, luckily, in Phoenix and Philadelphia, and but sort of threatening ones. But most important, let's delegitimize the vote. Or do we say, that's not? Do we actually say no, as some governors have? No, we need to count the votes. Or do we go into radio silence, which is the typical Republican elected official response? I mean, it is wrong, I think, unfair to say, oh, well, the parties are responsible, everyone's screaming and yelling, social media, cable TV, the culture's collapsing. The Democratic nominee is not being a demagogue. He is saying count the votes. The Democratic Party is saying count the votes. Really, almost every day, I've really heard almost nothing that I can object to from a Democratic elected official in this very tense moment. It's not as if they don't have some risk here and wouldn't like to stop counting in Arizona and so forth. And there's not been really and then even on the left, no one's really saying that. So the irresponsibility is asymmetric at this point, I believe. And that's and for those who therefore think both parties are equally dangerous right now, I think for me, this is a real-time evidence that that's not the case. One party is pretty willing to just embrace a totally sort of anti-democratic and anti-legal kind of point of view, and the other one, whatever they might wish and hope and be tempted to do occasionally, isn't, and certainly not the nominee. So that's, I think, important. Republican Party, I'll say just a word about the Republican Party and the Democratic Party and then stop. And about the future and then stop. Republican Party, I mean, the big question is how much repudiation of Trump and Trumpism will there be? It would have been a big repudiation if Trump had gotten clobbered and the Republicans had lost the Senate. 3 presidents have lost re-election bids in the last century. And I wrote a little piece categorizing these. Bush 92, lost, but it was, time for a change. 1992, 12 years of Reagan Bush. But Democrats already held the House and the Senate, but they didn't pick up seats in either party. And no one really thought it was a massive repudiation, I don't think, of the party. And in fact, Republicans promptly won both houses in 94, so pent up demand there. But and so that's sort of the mildest form of incumbent losing. I say this all in the context of it's pretty rare for incumbents to lose, and therefore it's sort of a big deal. 1980, Reagan beats Carter, brings in 12 Republican senators on an aggressive agenda. That's a pretty big defeat for an incumbent and represents a bit of an inflection point, maybe more than a bit, in American politics. 1932, Hoover loses by 17 points, and massive sweep. I think 97 Democrats, the seats in the House picked up by the Democrats, and that represents a very big inflection point, fork in the road for American politics. So if you think of those as the kind of 3 models, weirdly, I mean, Trump does not have a lot in common with George H.W. Bush, but this is more like 92 in the sense that they held to the Senate. That wasn't the case in 92 because they didn't have either body, but that there was no, the other party gained seats in the House. And, it's kind of a rejection of the current president as not being quite right for the times, but not a big repudiation. I would have liked a bigger repudiation. I think it makes it less likely that the Republican Party moves away from Trump or Trumpism in a very decisive way, which I would have liked, but maybe others would say that's better, that they can incorporate the good parts of Trumpism and, just get rid of the kind of crazy personal stuff from Trump. That's, I think, going to be a pretty strong point of view of a lot of people. Very hard to think. The one thing I really just don't know is, once he's out of office, how strong is he? I mean, I have friends, my colleague Jonathan Last thinks he remains very strong. His family, his supporters, his blessing in 2022 or 2024 in primaries remains a huge force in Republican politics. Other people, my friend Mike Murphy, for example, the Republican consultant, thinks, once you've lost, and you're sort of very strong now, and you're pretty strong in February of 2021, and you're less strong in October of 2021, and by mid-2022, it's like, we're moving on to other things and other people emerge. And that would be a sort of way in which Trump and Trumpism could be sort of worked out of the system without a coming to grips with it, without a repudiation, without a Truth and Reconciliation Commission and the like. And obviously lots of people supported and voted for Trump, not for Trumpy reasons. They didn't trust the opposition, they liked certain policies and all that. And how much of that becomes dominant as opposed to the Trumpist strains in the party, how much of that gets repressed again a little bit and becomes just a sub-theme. How important is it that that stuff be confronted? And people have different views on that. But I think that's very, very hard for me to tell right now. We really haven't had a president like Trump, so we haven't had an next president like Trump, assuming he loses. And therefore, I think the future of the Republican Party is a big question mark. Future of the Democratic Party is a pretty big question mark too, even if Biden wins, as he seems likely to. It wasn't a great showing for the party as a party this year, and what should have been pretty good circumstances, a recession and mismanagement of the pandemic and so forth, and a Democratic candidate at the top of the ticket who wasn't alienating anyone. They didn't pick up any state houses, I think. They lost seats in the House. So they are not in fully, they do not have in any way a solid majority support in the country. They have a tenuous majority. They're going to be led next year by what is Biden, a 77-year-old, 78-year-old, I think he's inaugurated president, a 79-year-old, perhaps Speaker of the House, and 73 or something year old Senate Minority Leader, Chuck Schumer. They need to have a generational change, which has been put off. Maybe that will happen, of course, in time. I will say, since maybe I've sounded somewhat ungracious about Joe Biden, I now think, looking at the returns, that it may be that Joe Biden is the only Democrat who could have won this election. I don't think all those votes stick with Elizabeth Warren or Bernie Sanders or Kamala Harris or maybe Pete Buttigieg. I mean, I think in some respects, it's one of these bizarre ironies of history. Biden, who's written off in 2015-16, is discouraged from running by his own president when he's vice president, comes back at an advanced age and saves the party. He in turn, incidentally, ironically, after doing so badly in the traditional primaries in Iowa and New Hampshire that normally select the nominee, promptly goes to South Carolina and is saved by African-American voters down there. But does Biden have a real mandate? I wouldn't say that much. I think he has a mandate not to be like Trump. But where does he take the party? What's the balance of power between the left and the center? How does it play out? I mean, that's huge questions. Finally, just in this, so I don't know what either party looks like over the next few years. I don't know what the overall system looks like. I mean, just take an obvious question. Biden and Mitch McConnell, they've worked together. They're old pros. One can imagine them compromising a fair amount. And maybe that's actually some of the, weirdly, after this divisive election, maybe you end up having some of the gridlock breaking, at least in some individual areas. Or maybe we just have trench warfare. It's World War I. Everyone just fights the fight for 2 years, and it sets the groundwork for, the 2022 election where Republicans think they can pick up the House, and then for 2024 where it's an open election. If Biden were not to run again, it would be, open seat for both parties. I mean, it's a very contingent moment, very reminder that these things are not determined, or one shouldn't be too deterministic about them. One of the biggest things is, though, is the Biden administration successful? I mean, does it govern, does it solve enough of these problems, deal with enough of these problems well enough that people think, well, that's a reasonable pattern for the future or not? And you can write very different scenarios, I think, based on whether Biden is, Jimmy Carter or Bill Clinton, let's just say, to take two recent Democratic presidents, just in terms of how they did by the end of their first term. So I don't, and Biden was actually senator for both of them, so he remembers both of them. So I really think there's so many variables at play. My general sense, though, is that I'm not personally very thrilled about the way the Republican Party is likely to be over the next few years. I'm worried about the Democratic Party. I think there's a big vacuum in the center. Maybe that can be filled either by coalitions and groups and particular issues, or informal coalitions. That's often been the way it's been done in American politics. I don't think it's totally out of the question that you could have even a new party. It would take a lot of things breaking right. But a young student at Columbia, I think it was, when I spoke a couple of years ago, came up to me after my talk and said, I hope you're right, that there's a future for this kind of pro-free market, pro-liberal world order, pro-traditional American exceptionalism type party. He said, I'm 21, I really don't want to have a choice for the next 20 or 30 years between a socialist party and a nativist party. I'm not sure socialist was quite captured what he wanted to say about the Democrats. Maybe let's say a party, identity politics party or something, a woke party and a nativist party. He didn't want either of those. And it does seem to me there's an awful lot of room in American politics for a political movement, maybe not a party, that is neither too woke nor at all nativist. Thank you.
And Bill Galston, you may unmute yourself and go next.
There, I finally succeeded. Well, I always look forward to this event, and I want to thank Harvey Mansfield for allowing me to return. I mean, we began in 1992, and we're now into the third decade of the 21st century. Amazing. But I've never looked forward to this event more than I do this year, because I really want to see the great Kristol Caesar debate over Donald Trump and the future of the Republican Party. I found myself a very nice foxhole to land in as the missiles fly overhead. Let me begin exactly where Bill Kristol did on an historical note, and make his opening point in a slightly different way. The election of 2020 is the 9th consecutive election where where the winning presidential candidate has not achieved a margin of victory of 10 percentage points or more. There is no precedent for this period in American history. The nearest analog I can find is the five post-Civil War elections preceding the election of 1896, although that wasn't a landslide either. That was a period when the political parties were closely divided numerically, but not particularly deeply divided ideologically. What we have right now is a situation, and it is not new. It's been gathering force really since the late 1980s, where the two major political parties are both closely divided and deeply divided. And that fundamental fact really helps to explain the extraordinary problems of governance that we have experienced for much of the past 30 years. Turning to the 2020 election, as everybody knows, there was a huge turnout this year. In fact, the highest share of the voting eligible population since the year 1900. So in this respect, there was continuity between 2018, which was the highest midterm election since 1914, and 2020. 2 years ago, we had what I'll call an asymmetrical polarization. That is, a huge turnout of Democrats, but not such a large turnout of Republicans. This year, by contrast, we have had a symmetrical polarization with massive turnouts on both sides, and Donald Trump's effort to raise the intensity of the base that he created in 2016 to an even higher level succeeded. And it had the sort of the Newtonian reaction, Newtonian effect of creating an equal and opposite reaction among Democrats. Now, this election, the turnout, the expected turnout is so large, about 159 million voters, that we still have, as we speak, between 17 and 18 million votes left to be counted. And I make this point, in order to emphasize that the figures that we see now are not fully representative of what the figures will be when all of the ballots have been counted. As Bill Kristol said, we are likely to see, when the counting stops, a Biden margin of 4 percentage points in the popular vote, or maybe a bit more, which translates into between 6 and 7 million popular votes. It's not a landslide, not close, but it's not a squeaker either. It's somewhere in between, a comfortable victory, the sort of victory that George W. Bush enjoyed over John Kerry in 2004, and Barack Obama enjoyed over Mitt Romney 8 years later. We've learned a lot from this election. We've learned, first of all, about some structural changes in the Electoral College. Let me name just a few. First of all, Florida, Ohio, and Iowa can no longer be regarded as pure swing states. I would call them contested states with a Republican default setting. Everybody expected that Trump would do worse in those 3 states, substantially worse than he did in 2016, when he scored massive margins of 8 percentage points in Ohio and 9 percentage points in Iowa. But he came very close to equaling that performance in 2020, and he bested it in Florida. Second, talk about an equal and opposite reaction. The rumors of rising Democratic competitiveness in portions of the South and the Southwest, and in particular North Carolina, Georgia, and Arizona, were not exaggerated. Those states are now in play between the 2 political parties and are likely to remain so. And I think that changing demography has a lot to do with that, but we can argue that point. Third, to the chagrin of some ambitious Democrats, one might say overreaching Democrats, Texas is still several political cycles away from genuine competitiveness. People began imagining that Texas was an enlarged version of Georgia. Not so. I spent 10 years in Texas, and I could have told them so. So much for the Electoral College. What about demography? Here I'd say we've learned what we should have known all along. The term Latino is a census category that does not denote a group with a single unifying experience or set of concerns. I mean, you can create a Latino continuum with Cubans at one end and Mexican Americans at the other end, and everybody in between. Country of origin matters a lot. Experience in country of origin, like, for example, leaving an alleged socialist paradise like Cuba or Venezuela or Nicaragua, that makes a big difference. And a friend, a friend of mine has made the interesting point that Latinos could turn out to be the Italians of the 21st century. That is, a group that was very family oriented, very entrepreneurial, religious. And if that turns out to be the case, then the analogy that many Democrats have tried to draw between African Americans and Latinos and other immigrant groups will simply fail. And if that analogy fails, then the doctrine of demographic determinism falls with it. Second demographic lesson, color is not destiny for white Americans either. It turns out that the contemporary Democratic Party, if it nominates the right presidential candidate, can improve its standing among white voters, woke or not. Let me give you three figures to illustrate this point. Overall, Joe Biden improved on Hillary Clinton's performance among white voters by 5 percentage points, moving that up from 37 to 42%. Biden did especially well among white men, moving the Democratic total up from 31% to 40%. This is a dramatic improvement. And talking about the heart of the Trump base, non-college whites, Joe Biden improved on Hillary Clinton's performance by 6 percentage points, moving from 29% to 35%. 35% is nothing to write home about, but it was enough, I bet, to make the difference in the major Midwestern swing states. A final demographic reality of note, and I think Bill has already touched on this point, Bill Kristol, large gender gaps opened up among both Black and Latino voters. By contrast, the gender gap among white Americans was only 3 percentage points, barely within the margin of error. Not to put too fine a point on it, Black and Latino men responded much more affirmatively to what I will call the Trump style than their female counterparts did. And explaining why that is so would require a long conversation in cultural history. Finally, an ideological reality. Biden won the election for a number of reasons, but an important part was appealing to the great American middle. He improved the Democratic share of voters who regard themselves as moderate from 52% in 2016 to 64% in 2020. I would have to go back a long way to find a time when a Democratic candidate won 64% of moderate voters. And he improved in 2016. Hillary Clinton lost independence to Donald Trump by 4 points. This time, Joe Biden bested Trump among independents by 14 points. On a podcast earlier today, I uttered verbatim what Bill Kristol said in his opening remarks. And I mean verbatim, that looking at these figures, Joe Biden may have been the only Democratic nominee who could have defeated Donald Trump. I can't prove that, but it's certainly possible. This election confirmed my longstanding view that Donald Trump didn't win in 2016 so much as Hillary Clinton lost. What do I mean? Well, in 2016, fully 54% of the American people didn't want Donald Trump to be president, but Hillary Clinton got only 48% of that 54%. In 2020, my estimate shows, and all the dust settles, it will turn out that 53% of Americans didn't want Donald Trump to remain as president. But the difference this time is that Joe Biden got between 51 and 52 of those 53 percentage points. And that's the difference. He was able to mobilize the entire anti-Trump coalition within the electorate. People saw this election as binary. Either Biden or Trump. They did not seek out alternatives. The 6% the 6% for third party and independent candidates was much higher than normal 4 years ago, and the 1 to 1.5% to seek out such alternatives this time is well below normal. A few concluding comments. Looking at the issue frame of this election, Joe Biden won despite failing to make the pandemic the central focus for the electorate. And this brings up a really interesting point about polling. When you ask, as one group did after, one exit polling group did after this most recent election, what is the most important issue facing the country? Pandemic was number one. The economy was second. But when another group asked them, what is the most important issue shaping your vote? The economy rose into first position, and the share saying the pandemic fell by half. So, and I think the mistake that many analysts made, myself included, was to assume that if a voter regarded an issue as the most important issue facing the country, that it would be the most important factor shaping his or her vote. Just not true. In this respect, Donald Trump appealed, I think, more successfully to the self-regarding face of voters, than for the, other regarding face of voters. And there may be a lesson in that. So it turned out that it was the economy, stupid, after all. And the reason that Joe Biden was able to win, despite the fact that he failed to frame the election the way he wanted to, was that voters were almost as likely to regard him as the more effective economic manager as Trump. So it was a Pyrrhic victory for the president. He got his way with the issue frame, but he didn't make the sale that he was decisively better. Two more comments, and I will subside. This was a comprehensive failure for the Democratic Party at every level below the presidential level, right? Whether you're talking about the Senate, the House, or state legislatures. And this has some implications. Number one, the Republicans will control the redistricting process next year, as they did a decade ago. And that is of some importance for the future political balance of the country. Number two, the progressive agenda is completely stalled in Congress, at least for the next 2 years. And the choice facing the progressive wing of the Democratic Party is not how hard to press Joe Biden so they can get their preferred legislative agenda enacted into law, because that cannot happen. The question is, how much will they harass him for doing the only thing that he can do in these circumstances? Which brings me to my third implication, and that is that the most important relationship over the next 2 years and perhaps longer will be between President-elect Joe Biden and Senate Majority Leader presumptive Mitch McConnell. They had a working relationship when they were in the Senate together, and on more than one occasion during the Obama-Biden administration, when conversations about legislation hit a wall, McConnell would send a message to the White House: "Send me Biden, right? We can work it out." So there is some reason to believe that that relationship will not be as instantly antagonistic as the relationship between President Obama and Mitch McConnell. But if Senator McConnell decides that that the advantage of the Republican Party in the short term lies in stalling everything, we are in for a pretty grim 2 years. I hope he is prepared to do business with a president who is prepared to do business with him. Finally, I'll stray outside my lane, as they say in the White House, to consider some implications for the Republican Party. I would say, and Bill may want to disagree with me, that the hopes of anti-Trump Republicans for some kind of restoration of the status quo ante have been dashed. I do not see that happening over the next 4 years, as they say on the exam papers, discuss. And I say that because I think we can now specify what the coalitional composition of the Trumpified Republican Party is. It is very strongly small towns and rural areas, not the cities, and of diminishing strength in the suburbs. The base of the base is whites without a college education, and evangelical Protestants and conservative Catholics. That is the Republican Party. Members of the business community are increasingly disaffected. Joe Biden raised more money from corporate America than Donald Trump did, for good reason. And in my judgment, the best that can be expected for the Republican Party over the next 4 years and perhaps longer is what I will call Trumpism with a human face. Having said that, and in conclusion, Trumpian populism can yield some surprising results. I note with interest that the same Florida electorate that gave Trump a substantial victory voted the same day to raise Florida's minimum wage to $15 an hour. You may think that there's some contradiction lurking in that conjunction. I don't agree. Over to you, Jim.
Good. Thank you. I'm a little ashamed to break up this party that's been going on since 1992 and to be brought in at this late date. Harvey referred to me as a defender of Donald Trump, something I've never heard mentioned before as a defender. It doesn't mean that I'm about to go on tomorrow and recommend a special prosecutor to begin the impeachment, or at least the investigation of President Biden for his activities with the Chinese communists, both himself and his family, or anything like that. Hope to take a more moderate view. We find ourselves today in this curious situation, suspended between two possible outcomes. The more probable, though still unassured, is the election of Biden, and the far less likely, but still possible, is the election of Donald Trump. I'd like to take a step back from this partisan question and focus for a minute our attention on the national interest. And here, where else to begin but from the famous old saw of the 19th century German thinker, Otto von Bismarck, who said, "God has a special providence for fools, drunkards, and the United States of America." So is there a way that the Almighty's guiding hand is at work in this election, rescuing us from a kind of disaster? Is there a way that in a nation in which fewer and fewer people read from the same Bible and pray to the same God, or for that matter, any God, is there a way that we are mysteriously being guided in the right direction? Those who take the time to think about it today will see that the great threat to America comes from something that, while it has something to do with political differences, finds its true core in the cultural realm, in a powerful set of ideas that has turned its back on the American heritage, that despises our traditional beliefs, that has turned to fictitious narratives of our history, that seeks to cancel and undo much of Western thought and beliefs, that is roiling our universities, and now, even more importantly, bursting our cities into violence, into militia culture, and into wanton and open iconoclasm of our nation's heroes in the destruction of statues, in the belief in a form of thought aided and embedded by what I'll call ultra-progressive views. Everyone recognizes that the Democrats picked a weak and fragile individual at this stage of his life, though all things considered, he surely was the best thing available to them. Here was someone who had barely secured early victories in the primaries, lost miserably, who at the last moment was saved in his position by Jim Clyburn, who helped him up miraculously and rapidly, catapulting him to the nomination. What may the election bring us? If Biden is elected, it will give us a president who will enter office with a weak and fragile backing, who enters the office really with a non-mandate. Leftist Democrats are now awakening to the fact that they have lost, not gained seats in the House, which is unusual, and that their expected takeover of a majority in the Senate has not occurred. Against all expectations, the much anticipated blue wave that was spoken of, bolstered by a media over the past few months that promised a Democratic victory, and also by a profession, so-called, of the pollsters, who also promised the victory for the Democrats. This wave has turned into a tiny ripple, a reverse tide, dribbling harmlessly back into the ocean. The hope for Trojan horse of the left that was celebrated by Bernie Sanders and Octavio Paz will likely not be feeding in the progressive trough. This is what this election has seemed to signal. The deepest division in American politics today is not between Democrats and Republicans, though it seems to be that on the political level, but rather between the progressive left in this country and the center and the right. The tragedy in all of this is that the center, as found in the Democratic Party, has been unwilling to stand up strongly for the basic core of America, and has allowed itself to be dragged and pushed around by the progressive intellectual forces. The center of the Democratic Party has been weak beyond all measure, pushed around in every direction. it would be welcome to a species of partisan Republicans if the president, President Trump, was reelected, and if he could continue his heavy-handed way to carry out this fight against the ultra-democratic left. But the truth is that the outcome should help assure us that, in Biden's case, that he will be utterly blocked. The non-mandate he received, and the fact that the Senate will always be opposed to an ultra-progressive view, doesn't really give much solace to the progressive left. And maybe, and just maybe, this may be gratifying, it begins to stand up against it, that they will end support for intersectionality, whatever that means, end support for the cancel culture, to the attacks on law and order. So maybe this too is a possibility, that this will be a good outcome for this election, in which the ultra-democratic left will be cabined off to some extent, and some sort of arrangement could be worked out between Republicans and the president. And now look at it from the other side. In the rare cases that an incumbent president has been defeated, like Jimmy Carter, who was decisively bested by Reagan in 1980, the defeated party has been entirely rejected. I don't think this is going to happen to Donald Trump, barring perhaps some typical Trump-like steps in the ensuing period of talking too much and going too far. The truth is, though, that when Donald Trump leaves office, if he does, he will leave as a celebrated figure in his own party, not one who was rejected like Carter or quickly forgotten like George H.W. Bush, but as someone who dramatically expanded the Republican Party, who nearly won this election, assuming that he doesn't win it. His supporters will see him as someone who prefigures the future, not someone who has been defeated by history. This is one of the most important short-term consequences of this election, and by far the most bitter for the progressive left. Trump is not going to exit this office discredited or humiliated, as the progressives sorely hoped for and dreamed of for the last 2 or 3 years. With Harvey, being here, I can't omit referring to Alexis de Tocqueville, who reminded us that in a national election, it's important, of course, to determine who will win the office, but having a majority is far more important for showing where the majority lies, for showing that you have a majority in the country as a form of power. This is much of what gives underlying power in a democracy, knowing that you're the majority. Even if Donald Trump is defeated, the left is not going to have the result that it wanted from this election. It won't have Donald Trump humiliated. And I'll say a final word about what will happen to the Republican Party. There have been 2 theories about what the election of Donald Trump would mean. Theory 1, this is the election in which it's regarded by some as an aberration or a horrible mistake. In George Will's word, it will be a parenthesis, 4 years of insanity, followed by the Republican Party returning to its original roots. It will get rid of Donald Trump and Trumpism. It will bring back the old Republican Party and restore its old figures to power. The doors will be thrust open, and the old spokesmen like Pete Wehner and David Frum from the Atlantic magazine, Michael Gerson and Jennifer Rubin from the Washington Post, all of them will get their jobs back in this anti-Trump reaction. All these people who served writing 99% of their columns 99 times a day about what's wrong with Trump, they will not, in this view, they will come back to power and be given their commanding positions in the Republican Party. And with Bill, I agree, this ain't going to happen. It's not the same party, the Republican Party, anymore. And then the second theory is that Trump might not be the most articulate purveyor of ideas, but over the course of the last 4 years, he has managed to convey a rough idea and direction of where he's going. Trump's presidency has shifted the party dramatically in tone and in substance. The heart of the party has changed. Its base is now identified as populist, a working class party, a party that stands for what the common people stand for what the whole, for those who work for jobs in smaller businesses. This is the core of the Republican Party, found in the smaller cities and in the rural areas of the country. The strenuous effort Democrats have to make us depict Trump as a billionaire mogul has failed miserably. Trump emerged in this last election not as a billionaire millionaire, but as the champion of the little guy, completely and entirely. Across the country, he was followed by this group. Meanwhile, Trump has shifted the image of the Democratic Party somewhat, making it look like the party as it is, of the top, the educated, the rich, and the party at the bottom, those who need the help of government. The changes in this case is not merely economic, but cultural. Trump is someone who defends the common people, acknowledges them, who insists that they not be pushed around, not be looked down upon or disdained by the highly educated and the righteous people who inhabit our universities and corporations, and by those who profess a love of democracy in theory while despising the people in practice, which is a good description of many in the Democratic Party. A most remarkable change has occurred in the image of the Democratic Party in this respect. So with that, I conclude my presentation.
Thank you, Jim. That's very good. So,
Thanks all three of you. Our first question comes from Ryan Hanley, professor of political science at Boston College. And I think it goes to all three of you. He says, claims about the illegitimacy of our foundational political institutions are on the rise on both left and right. What advice would you give to the winners of this week's congressional and presidential elections? How can they begin restoring faith in the legitimacy of our core institutions? You don't all have to answer every question every time if it's not specifically directed to one of you, but you can work it out amongst yourselves.
I guess everyone else is being so silent, I guess. I mean, political leaders, I think, great political leaders can perhaps do that in a certain way. Most, I think, competent political leaders do it indirectly by respecting the Constitution, providing a model of integrity and decency in high office. So I would say that's the George H.W. Bush model. I mean, he doesn't, which Biden might be more like. Not terribly eloquent, not maybe super reflective, but embodying many admirable American and human traits, I think, and resisting extremism of all kinds. I think, and here's where I just disagree with you. I mean, Jim and I are actually not that far apart analytically, I would say, in terms of the future of the Republican Party and so forth. We just have a different judgment about the relative merits and demerits of the course the party is on, and the relative danger of the threat from intersectionality, as Jim said, on the left, or from authoritarianism on the right. And I think the threat of intersectionality and cancel culture and all is greater in the universities. But in the country as a whole, I would say, especially after the last 4 years, I would say, there's a very big threat of authoritarianism, nativism, disrespect for the rule of law, setting groups against each other in really bad ways. President of the United States leading shouts of lock her up and so forth. Now, don't count the votes. And I think having this president be the sort of figure who seems to be defending traditional American virtues and institutions is the worst possible thing for the future. I don't think a single young person I know thinks, I don't like the cancel culture left. I don't like the, Howard Zinn history. But, what Trump is really convincing me that we need to respect our founding fathers and Abraham Lincoln, because Trump is really kind of what the whole experiment was designed to produce. Trump's patriotic education has done as much damage to patriotism as all the left-wing stuff in the universities, I think, or at least it was on a path to do that and sort of would have done that if he had a second term. So I'm a little wary at this point of encouraging leaders to do too much explicit, worrying one way or the other. Just if they just behave decently in office, and if the government looks competent and serious about dealing with genuine public health threats and other threats around the world and so forth, and if people look as if they care about their fellow citizens and aren't just using them for their own purposes and don't just routinely lie at the drop of a hat, I think a lot of these other things can be taken care of. And they have to be taken care of, and it's urgent that they be taken care of, and they're not all being taken care of adequately by other institutions. It's great to be in a country that has a very diverse, huge country with universities and churches and civic groups that are not controlled by the government and don't do what the government wants.
Yeah, I just put one point in. I look at America over the last, let's say, 6 months and see the problem is not so much in the universities. They always look at themselves and worry about themselves, which is adequate. It's on the streets. And if you've seen what's happened in America since the Floyd example, you see the outbreak of chaos, the destruction of law and order, the destruction of statutes, the burning of property, the looting, chaos overall. And what Democrat has spoke out against it? Not Joe Biden until he had to, didn't say a word against this. What centrist Democrat has had the courage to stand up and say, this is not how America can be ruled? And what Democrat is saying this today? It doesn't exist in the Democratic Party. They have to steal their courage. Trump, as you say, is an extreme version of this, but at least he's taking the stand in favor of a protection of law and order in the United States. At least it's an effort. It might not be the best, but it's a satisfactory effort to my side. I see the danger of Trump's demagoguery as being much less than something like this fictitious idea of authoritarianism, which I think is probably exaggerated. A demagogue he may be, an authoritarian, I'm not finally so sure that that's the case.
Well, I see that cancel culture is spreading, Jim, because you've just canceled me.
Do you want to say something, Bill G? No?
I just said it.
All right. Our next question is from Russ Muirhead, professor of political science at Dartmouth College. He says in 1992, the Dems were back in the saddle for the first time since, hold on, my screen, sorry. The Dems were back in the saddle for the first time since '79. They had unified control, but overreached and lost the House in '94. In 2002, the Republicans controlled it all, but their dreams of a durable, compassionate, conservative majority were lost in the sands of Iraq. The Dems win it all in '08 and keep the majority for exactly 2 years. The Republicans win it in '16, and they too blow it in 2 years. The question is the inability of either party to convince the people that it deserves to rule a problem with the party elites or with the people? That goes to all of you, I guess.
Bill G, this seems like a good one for you.
Yes, it does. It does, doesn't it? Well, Russ, I'm glad you're with us, and you've made exactly the observation about the vicissitudes of unified government over the past 20 years or so that I've been brooding about. Your history is absolutely correct. And what I would say is this, that a party that gains unified control of the government tends to overreach. It overinterprets the mandate that the American people have given it. I've spent years studying American public opinion, and I am persuaded that there is the makings of a great American middle. But that latent middle can't be activated, can't be made politically effective unless a Democratic Party, unless a Democratic president or a Republican president sets himself or eventually herself the task of activating it. I know that, Bill Kristol and troops were desperately afraid after the election of Bill Clinton in 1992. That was exactly what he was going to, making the Democrats the new structurally majority party as far as the eye can see. But, and I was there to see it happen, Bill Clinton overreached. And, the decision to go with healthcare and to shelve welfare reform turned out to be a political disaster, and one that fundamentally changed the political constellation of forces within which Bill Clinton had to operate for the next 6 years. The same thing happened to Barack Obama, and the same thing happened to Donald Trump. So I don't think the problem is with the people so much as with leaders, who constantly miss opportunities to reach out to and activate the great American middle. I don't have time to go through all of the polling that supports this proposition, but I will say that the issue that turned out to be the most significant in the 2016 election, namely immigration, is an issue, is a longstanding issue for which a longstanding solution endorsed not just by a majority, but by a supermajority of the American people has existed. It is the failure of elected public officials in both political parties to get to that solution that I think has weakened trust in our governing institutions. So just to get to the bottom line, Russ, I think the problem is top down and not bottom up.
Yeah, if I could just, Edward, I couldn't tell from Russ's question whether Russ thinks I think it's a correct analysis that there's the overreaching. Maybe that's just inevitable in politics. It's not necessarily a problem that neither party is the dominant majority party, or that the public reacts against overreaching by putting the other party in control of whatever branch they have a chance to do, the House or the Senate or sometimes the presidency. Then the question is, when you have divided government, mixed government, can you accomplish useful things and keep things on a steady course and have a reasonable foreign policy, maybe with some bipartisanship and so forth, or not? And I think the American tradition has actually been that work often works out fine. That's not such a terrible thing. But there's also a different version of two parties evenly balanced, which is gridlock and more divisiveness and more distrust of each other, and just sort of trench warfare politics at every turn, so that you can have a kind of healthy form of a balance of power, you might say, and an unhealthy form of a balance of power. And I don't know which we're heading for, and but I to get back to sort of Jim Caesar's strong statement, I don't know. I think I'm for a healthy form of centrism and moderation, if I can put it that way, and the best of liberalism and the best of conservatism. It's something Jim has written about, Harvey's written about. We've all written versions of things about that. And I just don't think that's achieved by pretending that the bulk of the problem is somehow entirely on one side that hasn't controlled the presidency, hasn't controlled the Senate, doesn't control a lot of these states, does control the universities a little bit and other places, and has certainly, Joe Biden did denounce the riots, heck of a lot more than Donald Trump denounced threats of violence and acts of violence. On his side, 22 people in El Paso were not killed by Black rioters. And there aren't even a total of 22 people have been killed in 6 months by Black rioters. We can just be honest here. So, I'm looking forward to all the conservatives being equally concerned about 2 Republican members of Congress fostering QAnon conspiracies and a really unhealthy growth of conspiracism and bigotry on the right. And I don't think in American history, to get to Ryan's question, that is sort of a, kind of edifying tale of the founders and of the past that doesn't acknowledge things. You don't have to be the 1619 Project to think that slavery is kind of an important part of the American experience, that Frederick Douglass and Booker T. Washington and W. Du Bois are important figures in America, that John Lewis was an important figure in the last 60 years. That's not just left-wing political correctness or something like that. So I guess I really think the sounder basis for moderation, both in practical politics and in our intellectual sort of self-understanding, is a kind of more complex view of our history and of our principles. And I don't think either party necessarily espouses that terribly well now, but at least Joe Biden actually defeated Bernie Sanders and Elizabeth Warren for the Democratic nomination. That's not a trivial thing,
Jim, do you want to weigh in on this? Or want to take the next?
No, we can take the next question. I had my say of what I think the Democratic Party, the leading voices in the Democratic Party had failed to say for months about what's been happening in the United States. Failed to say. And some have been active participants in it, going down to the level of the governors and the mayors of different cities, Democrats, who've taken the side of the mob and the militia, to the great destruction of property and loss of life. And the fact that this has not gone, not been refuted by political leaders is one of the great surprises and shocks that I've had in the last year.
So the next question comes from Charles Kessler, professor of political science at Claremont McKenna College and editor of the Claremont Review of Books. He says, Madison acknowledged eventually that the danger of minority faction from the Hamiltonian Federalists was actually greater than the danger of majority faction. Isn't it time to realize that Trump is right, that the administrative state and its allies in the media are the minority faction we need to fear and oppose today?
I mean, that's such that question carries so many assumptions about a whole understanding of the quote administrative state that would have to be unpacked that it's a little hard to answer. But I'll just say it this way. If one thinks that everything for the last century since the progressives, or most things since the New Deal, or most things since the Great Society and the Civil Rights Revolution were terrible developments that have to be opposed, that have created this nightmare administrative state and minority faction, a deep state governing us, and so forth, then yes, I suppose then one has to be a radical opponent of it. But then you can't claim to be embodying moderation. You're embodying a radical critique of the last century of America. I think you have some trouble claiming to be the party or the faction or the intellectual group that's pro-American because you dislike so much about America. Now, if you think the 75 years of maintaining since 1945 a reasonably decent world order without massive world wars, with hugely increasing prosperity for billions of people, if you think that the civil rights revolution, whatever its excesses and things that went off the rails and mistakes and the violence that accompanied it was on net not an important thing for American history, if you think that we need to get, what is the administrative state? Medicare, Social Security? I mean, what is it that what do you want exactly to change? I'm for reforming all these things. There are ways to do them that are much more market friendly. But is it GDP is supposed to go from 18, 19% government to 10%? Is that going to improve America? I just don't agree with that. And I don't think there's much of an intellectual argument apart from a lot of, there's some intelligent intellectual critiques of the progressives and Roosevelt and people in the 60s and 70s and 80s and 90s, but I'm sympathetic to some of those critiques, but therefore I'm not for simply defending all aspects of status quo, so to speak, or the administrative state or the deep state or whatever. But the idea that we're living in some nightmarish situation governed by some terrible minority that's preventing people from living decent lives and appreciating the great things about America and having opportunities in America, I don't buy that.
I just say I don't disagree with Bill, except when you look at what's been alleged to happen, I think has happened in some of our security parts of the administrative state, beginning with the accusation and you could say the spying on Trump even before he became president and when he became president, the misadventures really to the extreme of the FBI over the last 4 years. This is, I think, a huge problem that has to be addressed. Someone like James Comey, head of the FBI, not taking responsibility for lies being passed on to courts of government, obviously working in some ways to undermine the presidency, goes way, way too far. And probably is going on today from all we can gather. So it's a part of the administrative state, in my view, that we have to worry about, not the administrative state per se.
So our next question is anonymous. So Bill, don't yell at me, it's for you.
I'm not, I would never yell at you, you know,
Uh-oh.
except anonymously.
It seems like you got what you wanted, Mr. Kristol. Trump is out of office. What is your future policy agenda for the GOP and a successful 2024 GOP presidential candidate? You opposed the 2017 tax reform, the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act. You opposed Kavanaugh and many or most other Trump policy efforts, albeit they've been championed by Republicans for decades, with the exception of trade and immigration. Should a new GOP coalition disavow the entire Trump policy platform and adopt completely new policies? Or what Trump-era policies would you recommend a new successful GOP coalition keep or discard? I guess, Jim, that is a question also for you.
Well, it's such a big question. I don't think I opposed Kavanaugh. I opposed the arguments of some of his defenders, and defended actually Flake when he asked for the week extension, which he got and which seemed to clear Kavanaugh enough that he got through. So I don't have a problem with that. I mean, I don't think, I sort of agree with Jim on this, Jim Caesar on this. I don't think the Republican Party is going to be asking me for a lot of guidance over the next 2, 3, 4 years. And I think there are healthier and unhealthier versions of aspects of Trumpian populism. I mean, I think Trump has damaged the prospects of a, let's say, of a sensible debate. And Bill Galston's been in the forefront of this. And I think we together even endorse some of these, mild, let's say, restrictions maybe isn't quite the right word, but guidelines on immigration that would be not just throwing everything open and being concerned about the effects on wages of those already here. We certainly endorsed a tougher policy on China and the thing Bill and I did together in 2017 on trade. Trump's mixed all that up with so much nativism and cruelty that I think it's harder to defend, going to be harder to defend that. And if the Republicans do defend it, I worry it just goes right back to being Trumpist. So I think there is, for me personally, I'm for more traditional free markets, free trade, leadership of the liberal world order, and limited government, which I do not believe Donald Trump has really embodied. And I don't really think we need a federal government to be, telling us what patriotic education is and so forth. But I don't think, as I say, I don't have great hopes for the Republican agenda. And the truth is, though, under Trump, it's all been so consumed by him, and he's wished it to be that way, of course, and opposition to him, which I think necessary. Jim thinks overdone. I'll take that, whatever. But there's been very little policy thinking, except maybe, I guess there's going on in the think tanks, but I mean, we haven't had a serious policy discussion about anything, right? In America, we do have kind of big issues to deal with. What about the big tech companies? So some of those don't break right left even. I think there's conservative critiques that are legitimate of the current structure of big tech, liberal critiques, there are defenses on both sides. Foreign policy needs to be some fresh thinking. Maybe under the sort of umbrella of an Joe Biden who doesn't have a terribly ambitious agenda, who wants a kind of normalcy and has some basic. It has to get the pandemic under control and he'd like to be able to open up the economy responsibly. So that'll keep him busy for quite a while. Maybe we could actually have more of a real policy debate and maybe a slightly less partisan and crazy policy debate than we've had with Build the Wall, for example. I mean, immigration is an issue Bill's worked on for 15 years. I don't think Trump has helped those. I mean, maybe you can say he's put a spotlight on things and he was able to finally get people to focus on certain problems or whatever, but I think he's ultimately damaged those who want to have a serious debate. I feel this personally. I mean, if the choice is Trumpist restrictionism or just liberal immigration policy, I'm for liberal immigration policy. If the choice is an intelligent form of ways of selecting immigrants and making sure the flow isn't excessive to overwhelm wages and so forth, I'm not sure if that argument's right or not, but that's a different thing. So I hope we can have a more reasonable debate in both parties. And maybe with Trump removed, there can be a much more ferment in the Republican Party. There's some intelligent people in the Republican Party. You'd never know it in the last 4 years. They either defend Trump or they're terrified to say anything. So they just keep their head down.
Let me take Bill's ending as my point of departure and make what I hope will be a productive proposal for the party that's not mine, as well as for the party that is mine. Under Donald Trump, and I give him some credit for this, a more realistic view of the relationship between the United States and the People's Republic of China has become the lingua franca of both political parties. This is a huge shift because it represents a shift in the center of gravity of both political parties from one position to something very, very nearly its opposite. I think what we've learned in the 4 years of the Trump administration is that the effort to use, every economic and diplomatic and to some extent military asset to induce the Chinese to change course, to force them in particular out of their distinctive program of domestic economic development, has failed and cannot succeed. What I draw from that is that we need to think anew about what we need to do both at home and abroad to counter the rise of Chinese power. And I actually think that there could be a better discussion inside the Republican Party on that question, and a better discussion across party lines on that question. And some of the results would not be incompatible with a somewhat populist turn in the Republican Party. Let me give you an example. The Chinese will not abandon, and the Trump administration has not come close to getting them to abandon their Made in China 2025 program, which was designed to seize and is designed to seize the commanding heights of the technological revolution, and then to dominate the world economy based on technological mastery. We can't force them to stop that. So we're going to have to emulate them in some respects. We're going to have to get much more serious about investing in basic science and technology. We're going to have to get much more serious about nurturing, to be Hamiltonian for a minute, infant industries or emerging industries that may be the dominant industries of the future. This will not happen through the invisible hand. It will require the very visible guidance of the state in order to make it come about. Could we agree on a reasonable program of domestic economic and social development that would put us in a much stronger position to counter the number one threat to the United States for at least the first half of the 21st century? I think the answer to that question is yes. And I think there are intelligent people in the both political parties that are prepared to contribute to that discussion. And by the way, I will give the Trump administration some credit for at least beginning the process of reweaving the network of alliances, stretching from India to Australia, that will be needed in order to create some sort of international framework for this effort. I don't think well, why don't I just stop there? But I think this is one way of thinking about a possible future that is not only better than the one we now faced, but also substantially more consensual than the arguments of the recent past would suggest.
The next question is from Jennifer Hochschild. She's in the Harvard Government Department. Can you say more about the Electoral College and perhaps by implication, the Senate? What was perhaps a necessary compromise in 1787 that created a constitution of states rather than individuals has generated even more highly unequal representation? As Bill G says, discuss.
Sounds like a Jim Caesar question to me,
Yeah.
which doesn't mean that the rest of us won't join in.
There's thousands of things to be said on behalf of the Electoral College, even under the circumstances noted. Those get into technical issues, but in a way, it focuses the campaigns on states and on different regions of the country. And the center of the election is still the Electoral College. People think in terms of states. Now, if you think that states are unimportant, that's one thing. If you think that they hold an important role in our country, that's something completely different. And so I have a certain sympathy for the Electoral College with all its misgivings. I don't think this country is, by definition, a country of universal democracy. It just isn't. It wasn't formed that way. Promises were made to different states to have certain rights and privileges within a larger federation. I recognize that there's been some nationalization, but not to the point that it eliminates the fact that people control territory. They have a certain way of life inside that territory, and that has to be preserved. As I see the future going into the United States, people are moving from state to state by virtue of what they think the states are doing. That they're going to leave California because they can't stand it there anymore. And they may go live, heaven forbid, in Nebraska. This gives a character to our country, which I think is worthy of being promoted. And it rests upon things like the US Senate. Plus, add finally, I know there's a lot of students from Harvard who leave Harvard and go back to some small state so they can become a senator.
I mean, I'm very sympathetic to the argument for decentralization and would be whether the Electoral College happened to exist or not, and whether the Senate happened to exist or not. And I think there's some very important Tocquevillean and citizenship arguments for people having the ability to, and sort of Hayekian experiments and policy arguments and et cetera, limits of national planning. So I'm very sympathetic to devolving power, where it's appropriate, not where it's not where different ways of life in states involve suppressing one race in the interest of the other or denying people their rights. The 14th Amendment is part of the Constitution, and so that needs to be taken seriously. It's as much a part, the way our amendment process is set up, as the original Constitution and this Republican guarantee, I believe, of government for each state. So they weren't pure states' rights people, the founders, by any means. So I'm very sympathetic, though, as a practical matter, to the decentralization. And I sort of tend to think, therefore, that the state structure, the emphasis on states, helps that. The Electoral College, I mean, it's funny when you go back and read, Jim knows this so well, I mean, the arguments for it, so much of the argument is for the college, not for the electoral side of it. I mean, Hamilton spends quite a lot of time in federal 67 to 77, very worried about the character. They've created a very powerful president, So looking at Harvey, I feel embarrassed to even be saying this, but he's written about, much more, knows much more about this than I do. It's thought much more deeply. They've created a very powerful president. They're worried about, it's not going to be possible to constrain him entirely by parchment barriers and other such things. You want him to have the power he needs to have, the energy and the unity in the executive. And therefore, they're very worried about the character of the president as an individual. And that's why they wanted the original Electoral College. So we didn't just have random people, demagogues or party hacks or others, or representatives of individual regions even, becoming president and so forth. That's obviously long gone. Then Jim has written a lot about this. The parties step up and they play a sort of de facto role as a kind of intermediate between the people and the presidential nominating process for a long time, right? Really, what, a century and a half almost. And now we're much closer to a kind of somewhat random process where people show up and put themselves forward and hit a nerve or have a lot of money or meet the moment, and that can be good and it can be worrisome. And the Electoral College then just becomes this sort of mechanism which slightly favors, it's not clear who really favors, honestly, but for now, slightly favors the Republican Party. But yeah, that seems to be the way the least problematic is. The one thing I would say about the Electoral College is a matter of civic education, which was referred to earlier by, I think, Ryan's question and others. I was struck by this way before the last couple of elections where the Electoral College helped the Republicans. It has a bad effect in a way on civic education, in the sense that if you don't live in a competitive state, you don't experience the campaign. I've always thought if when we're designing it from scratch, I'd be much more inclined to have some form of proportional representation made in Nebraska. I've tried to do a version of this in the Electoral College. It's not healthy for half or 2/3 of the country to just not have anything to do with the election and never feel like, never see a television ad, never have a visit by a candidate, not have all the attendant stuff that goes on with surrogates. You do. That is kind of part of the democratic process and part of the civic process. And if you live in California, I'm very sensitive. This was in Virginia. We used to be a swing state, so we used to get everything. It was too much. Of course, you couldn't watch TV for 2 minutes, without an ad. And now you get nothing since it's not a swing state. And so I'm more, I don't think we reinvent. I'm enough of a Burkean and all this that you can't just reinvent it and start it all over again. But as an objective matter, I'm not sure how the Electoral College does some damage. It does less damage probably than progressives think. The Senate isn't changing. It does disproportionately help smaller states because the more power, no question. But I think as this election shows, incidentally, it's not an insuperable bar to liberal or progressive legislation. So I'm a little bit of a skeptic that the biggest problems are the Electoral College or the Senate. And my main evidence for this is look at the House of Representatives. I mean, the Republicans have controlled it a lot since 1994, and they're not exactly losing it by a ton now. And that is an pretty actual popular. And incidentally, if there weren't gerrymandering, which is a problem, I think. But even so, as Phil and I were saying, what do they lose the national House vote by? 1.5 points or something. So it's not as if, there are a lot of people out there who prefer the Republican agenda. So I'm a little bit of a skeptic that any of these things is as much of a bar to reasonable policymaking or even to liberal policies as some people think.
Let me just add a word here. I do think that there's a problem that goes deeper than policy. And that is, and I can't prove this, but I strongly suspect it, that there has been a change in the public's understanding of legitimacy, of democratic legitimacy in a one person, one vote direction. And so aspects of the Constitution that may have been fully acceptable in past generations are now less so. And I think that some attention must be paid to the public's conception of what is legitimate. And as a thought experiment, suppose we had a political configuration of forces such that presidents who gain electoral college majorities on popular vote minorities, not even pluralities, became a very regular feature of our system. I don't think that would be a stable political situation from the standpoint of perceived legitimacy. So I'm not sure that where we are now with two of those examples in the past 20 years, and we've come very close to a third one this year, I don't think that that's a stable or sustainable situation. That's on the one hand. On the other hand, I am deeply skeptical that in the lifetime of anyone in this distinguished assemblage of 146 people plus, plus the panelists who are perhaps are less distinguished than the audience, for all I know. I'm very skeptical that there will be the kinds of fundamental constitutional amendments that would be needed to undo the decision of 1787. So what can be done short of that? And I have to say, and I haven't always believed this, and talk to me 2 years from now, and I may not believe it then, but I do think it would be better for the other 48 states to emulate what Maine and Nebraska have done compared to the status quo. Because at least one political candidate, Donald Trump, paid a lot of attention to the districts in Maine and Nebraska that might have gone either way. And that, despite the fact that in Maine it was clear that that Mr. Trump would lose the state by double digits. So it might help. It might help to equalize the attention that the two political parties give to different parts of each state. That would deal to some extent with the civic education question, but it would also break up, the sense that if you live in a state like California and you're a Republican, you are in effect unrepresented in the presidential contest, and vice versa for the states where Republicans have a lock year after year after year. And each state legislature has it in its power to make that change without further permission from anyone. And I think that would be better if they did. Now, no doubt, and I wouldn't have had the wit to say this 30 years ago, but no doubt there would be a lot of unintended consequences from this kind of change. Would that outweigh the intended benefits of making this change? I don't know. That's always a possibility, but I can only see what I can see in front of me. I can't look around corners. I'm not Tocqueville. That's Jennifer. That's how I'd respond to your question, by agreeing to some extent with the premise of your question that that certain imbalances built into the Electoral College do tend to generate legitimacy questions in modern circumstances.
Our next question is from Shep Melnick at Boston College. Bill Galston mentioned that Florida voted for Trump, but also for a $15 minimum wage. Conversely, California went big for Biden, but voted by a wide margin to keep the ban on affirmative action. What might this tell us about what Democrats will do, primarily administratively, on civil rights? Does this tell us anything about whether Democrats will be as woke as Jim fears?
The answer, Shep, is, and I mean this honestly, I just don't know. I would be very surprised if a Biden Justice Department turned out to be as aggressive as the Obama Justice Department was. I suspect that there will be much more of a focus on the functioning of the political system, as opposed to efforts to impose new administratively devised solutions in this area. And I think the example that you gave of California is apt, and a nice counterpoint to my Florida example. And I think it points to the fundamental fact that I'm trying to underscore, namely that there is an American center, an American majority that has a sense of what the appropriate equilibrium is among different arguments and different forces. So just to pick some obvious examples, in the wake of the various slayings of Black men at the hands of the police, there were various proposals made for how to react. Some were moderate, some were more extreme. Defund the police was roundly rejected by majorities of both political parties. And the presidential nominee, Joe Biden, was very, very quick to distance himself from that proposal. Not only that, but the proposal even to shift some funds away from police departments towards social services did not command a majority, not even close. There were proposals to increase spending, for example, for mental health professionals to be side by side with police in the kinds of circumstances that often lead to misunderstanding and violence. That is supported, and similarly, the fact that the California referendum went as it did doesn't mean that Californians have lost interest in, for example, who gets admitted to California colleges and universities. There is a sense of fairness and balance in the system. And I think that even if some forces in the Biden administration wanted to go beyond the perimeters of that majority sentiment, I doubt very much that the President of the United States would be very eager to accommodate them, because he understands the difference between sensible reform on the one hand and proposals that are bound to be both destructive and unpopular on the other. I hope I don't have to eat these words, but that's what I suspect, and that's the best I can do on short notice, Shep.
Anybody else? Then we'll move to the next question. And that is from Jeff Toulis at the University of Texas at Austin. Are executives too powerful? That is, has the promise of checks and balances failed us?
I suspect we all have views on that one.
You go first.
My short answer to that question is yes. And this is not a view I've come to recently. And Congress has been complicit in the handover of its powers to the executive branch. In the past 40 years or 50 years, more than 125 separate grants of emergency power have been authorized by the Congress of the United States to the President of the United States. In each case for good Hamiltonian reasons, but when you put them all together, it turns out to be a latent excess in the system, and I think that there ought to be, for example, a commission to line up all of those 125 plus grants of emergency powers, some of which were created for very special situations, but none of which have been lapsed because they weren't written with sunset provisions, and figure out which ones are still reasonable given the fact that circumstances have changed so much, and which ones are avenues of potential abuse. And to be frank, I would not be unhappy to see some change in the way the judiciary and the executive branch treat the issue of non-delegation, which has been so much debated recently. Ironically, the modern judicial architect of the administrative state is no other than Antonin Scalia, who spent a substantial portion of his career defending the ability, to delegate not only legislative but also some executive powers to administrative agencies. I think we ought to take a good hard look at that in view of what has happened in the 30 years or so since discretion to administrative agencies became the default setting of our judicial and political system. So, and I could go on at quite some length, Jeff, but let me just finish by saying this, that politics, like nature, abhors a vacuum. And when you have a non-functioning legislative branch, the powers of the legislative branch inevitably flow to the other parts of the government. And so you have both the judiciary and the executive performing functions for which they were not designed and which are not appropriate. And so, we can think about measures like pruning emergency powers, but ultimately we're not going to have a balanced, sustainable constitutional system unless and until we have a functioning Congress of the United States once again. And that is not an easy task, but it's an absolutely necessary one.
I mean, I strongly, I very much agree that Congress is really broken to a kind of amazing extent. I mean, we don't have budgets, we don't have hearings, we don't have just debates about legislation anymore. Stuff is written in the majority leader's or speaker's office and brought to the floor, and that's it. I mean, not that all those debates were so wonderful, and some of those committee markups were senators and congressmen doing favors for their constituents, and sometimes semi-corrupt favors for their, wealthy constituents or oil companies or whatever. But still, I mean, there was something resembling a actual deliberative process and at least a horse trading process. But you want a horse trading process in a interest group, pluralist, liberal democracy, and now it's so centralized in a way, and there's so many problems with Congress. But I mean, the problems with Congress is very much mixed up, obviously, with the problem with the parties. Because the one reason why the committees are so weak and you don't have authorizing and appropriating legislation and debates in the way we used to, is that there's such party control now, such party unity in Congress, which has become a premium to fight the other party, I guess, or fight the executive branch. And so we do have sort of various forms of trench warfare in various parts of Washington. I would include the judiciary in this. And I don't know. On the one hand, it can go on, I guess, for quite a long time. It's sort of like people looked at World War I in 1915 and said, this is nuts. This is destroying countries. And it's, obviously having massively horrible effects. And we need something. But of course, they had no real idea of how to do anything much else. So they just slugged it out till 1918. And I've sort of thought about the last 4 years of everyone's got their favorite metaphors and, historical, different war metaphors, World War II, World War I, Civil War. But I mean, it feels a little bit like that now. And so for me, the question is, could one, in a kind of Burkean spirit of reform, not simply preservation, think about intelligent changes in Congress and in all kinds of other institutions that have become overdue. I mean, we've let things go now for quite a while. Under the left has always never been a fan of a kind of what I would characterize, maybe unfairly, as a sort of simple-minded, rational, technocratic rationalism of the left. But that's now been met by a simple-minded, reactionary adherence to every single thing that somehow vaguely comes out of the American past, especially if it's helped preserve various conservative forms of conservative power. And that those two armies are fighting by night in a very stupid way. I mean, the idiocy of the debates of the Trump years is really not good for the country. And I don't know if we can blame high schools and colleges and Howard Zinn all you want, but if you're a normal 20-year-old looking at these politics, do you think anyone has an intelligent argument to make about anything? You sort of have a common sense view that some things from the past should be cherished and other things should be honored, but maybe not cherished quite as much, and other things should be changed. And then you find no one making any kind of intelligent argument like that. And that's not been the practice for most, I don't think, of American history, but that has been the situation we've fallen into. So I think that is damaging to us, and maybe we can break out of the trench warfare weirdly in these next few years, maybe not all at once, and maybe it will take a lot of discrete efforts. I'm very struck, I'll just say, we're on the courts, for example. I've been pretty involved in, as a friendly observer, I'm not a lawyer or a law professor, but the Federalist Society, the originalism, textualism, Bob Bork, Nino Scalia, Ralph Winter, all the people who were involved in this. It was a very interesting and intelligent, I would say, reaction against a kind of judicial progressivism that Alex Bickel and others wrote about. I think it brought some very important aspects of critique to a kind of imperial judiciary, but it's now become itself a stale and formulaic doctrine. I mean, you can't really, I'm not just basing this on the Justice Barrett's hearings where she just didn't want to answer anything, but honestly, when you now hear people talking about it or the way in which it's applied, it's in a way as unthoughtful about really what the Constitution implies and requires, in my opinion, what judicial, being serious about playing the role of a judge, about fulfilling the roles and responsibilities of a judge are. It's not as bad. Maybe it is as bad. I don't know if it's bad on the right or the left, but I mean, so I'm sort of generally alarmed about this kind of, as I say, trench warfare politics, which has a lot of bad effects. But one of them is that everyone becomes stupider than they would otherwise be.
So my staff is overworked and feeding me fake news. This was a question not from Jeff Toulis, but from Kenneth Shepsley. My apologies. Shepsley. Jeff Toulis's question, we think, is about the pandemic. How come that the mishandling of the pandemic has had such an apparently little effect on the election outcome? This was asked by other people too.
So, I could say a word about that, since I was involved in Republican Voters Against Trump. So we did a lot of polling and focus groups and all the stuff you do these days. And my colleague Sarah Longo saw early on, and people didn't want to hear this, honestly, on the Democratic side and on the anti-Trump side, that the pandemic, they thought he'd mismanaged it. They thought that was characteristic of his slightly wacky management of the executive branch. They also thought, look, it's a very difficult thing to handle. No one would have been well prepared. These scientists are probably a little out of control and want to shut everything down, again, fairly or unfairly. I'm just saying that caricature got out there. Trump wants to open things up. Maybe he's right that we should go a little more in that direction. Some people say the European countries are doing better, but I read there was an outbreak somewhere and they had to close it down again. So maybe they're not doing better. it was striking in these focus groups that involved Trump skeptical voters, but a lot of them had voted for Trump in 2016. That's why we were doing focus groups for them, that they were pretty forgiving of it. They didn't think he was the greatest manager of a crisis ever, but they were pretty forgiving of him on the pandemic. And they wanted Biden to reassure them that he wouldn't shut the country down, which Biden tried to do a little bit in the last few weeks, but I think he went a little overboard. I'm not saying this is right or wrong. I myself sort of probably agree with where he was, but just as a political matter, a little bit sounded too much like, Tony Fauci was going to be running the country and no one would take into consideration economic matters, only, the purest kind of public health. I think it's a caricature, but nonetheless, I think Trump did a pretty good job of sort of building that caricature, and that Biden didn't have a plan to get the economy going. And people did want, Bill mentioned this earlier, that people really wanted to be reassured. Now, they got reassured enough that Biden did. This is where, at least, he talked a lot about Main Street economics, and they really adjusted the message. A lot of the paid advertising was pretty economics focused in the last 2 or 3 weeks. But it just, people had a lot of more tolerance than you would have thought for Trump on the pandemic. For me, it was kind of astonishing. I was so furious often, and I've personal, people I know who in the area of public health and doctors and stuff. And so I just couldn't believe people weren't more outraged. But I don't know, maybe there's a kind of public wisdom in that maybe I have too high expectations in some sense. But I do think politically it didn't affect things that much, which is why it's kind of astounding. I mean, at the beginning, before pre-pandemic, pre-recession, Biden was ahead of Trump by 4 to 6 points in a lot of the polls. And we ended up, after this unbelievably turbulent 8-9 months, with a Biden victory of 4 to 6 points. So I think he got more of a pass on it than I would like, but I think that was the realistic fact. And I think the Biden campaign did a pretty good job of adjusting to that fact, but they just couldn't, and especially the other, I'll just going on too long, but the outside groups who can't coordinate with the Biden campaign because of our bizarre campaign finance laws, we couldn't either. They were just deeply invested in the notion that if you put another $20 million on the air, making fun of Trump for suggesting that you should ingest bleach or whatever, that was going to move more voters. And we honestly, we had a lot of arguments about this, and Sarah would say, look, this is just not going to change anything. And believe me, I agree with you that he's behaved terribly, and but it's not going to change the actual swing voters' minds. It's a little hard to get liberal groups or even Lincoln Project type Republicans to understand that, though.
Let me just, and I'm not sure whether this is agreeing, disagreeing, or agreeing and disagreeing in part, but I'll venture a hunch, which can never be either validated or refuted. And that is, had it not been for the pandemic, Donald Trump would have been reelected.
It could be.
So, it may not have been his management of the pandemic per se that led to his narrow defeat, but still it was decisive. It was decisive in part because it interrupted the economic narrative and helped to even up the public perception of economic management between the president and his challenger. And also, I have to believe that in some subterranean way, it altered the mood of the country in a way that made it more receptive to an alternative to the incumbent president than it would have been otherwise. I can't prove either of those two propositions, but those are strongly held hunches.
Yeah, that sounds right.
Would you agree with the proposition that you shouldn't speak to Bob Woodward?
Well, I will tell you this, Jim. When I was in the White House, the aforementioned Bob Woodward was stalking the halls, and I refused to have anything to do with him, on the grounds that whatever I said would ultimately come back to bite me, and that I had absolutely no idea into what kind of narrative my words would be inserted. And as everybody who's been in this business knows, that's the decisive question. You can say something that is innocent in one comment, in one context, and damning in another. And I'm not saying that Bob Woodward is an arch manipulator. On the contrary, I think by Washington standards, he's a reasonably straight shooter. But I cannot imagine why Donald Trump was persuaded to open himself up in that way. The only hypothesis that I can think of, and I don't mean this to be invidious, but I just can't think of another one, is that he has overweening confidence in his ability to persuade people one-on-one, whether it's Bob Woodward or Kim Jong-un, right? That there's something about the Trump sales magic that will close the deal. And I think that is, a self-damaging illusion on Mr. Trump's part. Doesn't work that way.
Agreed.
We have a question from Roberta Schaefer, Emeritus President of the Worcester Regional Research Bureau. Please assess Trump's policy on the Middle East and how Biden may change it in light of potential influence of the Squad, etc., including Iran.
I mean, as someone who's a critic of Obama's Middle East policy, especially his, both with Israel and Iran, I was asked this a lot, obviously, and I think there are things that Trump did that were good. I don't think Biden's going to reverse them. The embassy's not going back from Jerusalem, and maybe Biden wouldn't have done that. Biden didn't do it. Bush didn't do it. So Trump deserves credit for seeing, I think correctly, that there was a lot of bluster about that, but it wasn't going to matter much. I don't know how important the Israel-UAE deals are, but it's not a bad thing. But that's not going to get reversed either by Biden. So I think the good news about Biden, from my point of view, is I think, let me put it this way. President Obama came in really thinking, and I don't even say this critically, but though I personally would be critical of it, but that he might be the person who presided over the birth of a peaceful, non-terrorist Palestinian state. I've heard he had said this to people, that he hoped to be for the Palestinians what Harry Truman was for the Jews, for Israel. And it wasn't a crazy thought. I mean, a lot of people hoped that would happen, and Clinton got kind of close in 2000. And after Bush had good relations with Israel, maybe there was a chance to build on that, but also change things a little. I always thought it was foolish, but whatever. But it certainly didn't happen. And Biden was very close to that and saw that not happen. I don't think, but it did color Obama's relations with Israel. I think it very much colored his relations with Netanyahu, whom he felt had really undercut him in this effort. And I think there was always a little bit of a issue, you might say, in Obama's mind with at least the current government of Israel. I don't think he came in hating Israel or anything. I just think he thought Israel was the government at the time of Israel was a problem for him, and it was a little bit of a edge in his dealings with Israel. I mean, he wasn't, at the end of the day, Israel did okay, but and then of course the Iran deal was sort of part of a certain kind of wishfulness to transform the Middle East in a certain in a certain way that I don't think was particularly well advised. Biden, I don't think has any of that about Israel. I think he now thinks he has no interest in trying to, less interest in the Trump administration, ironically, incidentally, in pursuing some fanciful peace at this time between, or further peace. I mean, there is de facto kind of peace between Israel and the Palestinians, or Israel and Hamas. So that really gets to Iran, I think, is the main issue. And that's complicated. I mean, you can't really go back into the deal of 2015. It's not clear where the Trump administration was going. They'd hit kind of a dead end. They were with maximum pressure, but they didn't have any allies putting the pressure on. So it wasn't clear what effect it was having. The Trump administration did nothing, as the Obama administration did nothing when there were actual demonstrations in Iran, first in 2009 and then a year or two ago, pretty impressive ones. And Trump did not exactly go out of his way to support the aspirations of the young people of Iran there. So I don't know what Biden's going to do there. My impression is they have a million other things on their mind, and they will kind of do a more conventional than Trump, but, kind of centrist, center-left Middle East policy, and hope that things don't blow up, honestly. And maybe they will blow up, maybe they won't, but I'm not terribly alarmed about it. I'm not terribly thrilled about it,
Jim, you want to comment on this?
Not really. I think he's done a good job, on the main points, as well as one could expect. And, in getting something going. But as to the intricacies of politics in that area, I have nothing to add.
We have another question for Bill, mostly, I guess, by Tom Palmer. He said, like 2 years ago, I should still like to ask what policies and accomplishment of Trump Mr. Kristol disapproves of. And I guess Jim could weigh in and counter-argue.
Well, what policies should one approve of? Has he improved healthcare in any serious way? Has he fixed Obamacare? Did he make any serious effort even to do so once the skinny bill ended up getting defeated? He put all his chips on a tax bill that I think is a very mixed bag, honestly, and kept the economic growth going, though in a very top-heavy way and in a way that did benefit the wealthy too much. But the economy as a whole did pretty well, so I'm not going to fall on my sword on that. I think there were much better ways to if you could spend that amount of money and run up deficits of $1 trillion before the pandemic. There were better ways to run up those deficits and spend that money on other kinds of tax cuts and some government programs. He hasn't done that. He hasn't didn't try to fix Social Security and Medicare, which are unsustainable, if one can sound more like a traditional Bob Dole Republican, which I guess Trump, of course, doesn't want to sound like. I don't know, immigration policy. I guess he shut it down pretty much, but at a huge human cost, I think, and again with no reform of our immigration system. I mean, what policies were passed by Trump and the Republican Congress when they controlled everything in those first 2 years, or even by Trump and the Republican Senate, which would have put pressure on Pelosi to do something in the subsequent 2 years? Not a heck of a lot. So I think it'd be one thing if the policies were so great that they overwhelmed the damage, I think, to the rule of law and to other important aspects of liberal democracy. But I don't really see them.
Jim, now you're up to defend.
Okay, good. First of all, I would say representation of a large section of the country that didn't feel represented before. That would include everyone from Charlottesville west to Sacramento. Large parts of the country that felt it had no voice, at least came to have a feeling that they had a champion. And that's pretty important. Secondly, I think that Trump has opened a way for the Republican Party to increase its support among minorities and Blacks. Ironically, because after the 2012 election, there was an autopsy. The forensics people went in and said to the Republican Party, you have to have Blacks and Hispanics if you want to win elections. So now go do what the Democrats do, give grants, et cetera, et cetera. Trump has found a new way to open this thing up. He's appealed to minorities by a technique of saying, what is it that you can do? And it's very interesting to see what's happening in this regard. His support among the Hispanics has gone up pretty significantly. I believe probably we can look forward to a time where there will be no distinctly Hispanic way of viewing things. In fact, if you look at the immigration issue as an important issue, do Hispanics want more Hispanics to come flowing into the United States? And the pretty clear answer from what I can gather is not really. They have the same view as Americans on whether this is wise or unwise, that we have to look at it. So he's opened that up. As for Blacks, this part is even more interesting. Someone who's been charged time and time again with being racist in every particular view. He's taken a view that especially to Black males and to rap singers, if not players for the NBA, he's taken the view that there's another way to go at it, offer them opportunities, and see if the number of supporters will grow. And it hasn't grown that much, but it's grown significantly. I can look forward, therefore, for a way to the Republicans to offer a way to including more Blacks, but not on the grounds of the progressive view that we're going to develop programs which we control, that will control your lives, that will help you, but on entirely different views of bringing them into the American mainstream.
Well, if I could just add a word on this question, I think Republicans who believe that Trump has blazed a path to a significantly greater appeal to African Americans and Hispanics and others should at least reflect on a couple of facts. In 2016, Hillary Clinton got 89% of the African American vote. In 2020, Joe Biden got 87% of the African American vote. Incremental progress at best. In 2016, Hillary Clinton got 66% of the Hispanic vote. In 2020, Joe Biden, who has been reviled for his mishandling of Latinos, got 66% of the vote. So the Trump revolution has had decidedly limited effects up to now. Can you see incremental progress? Yes. Can you look at the incremental progress that was made in the past 4 years and herald the dawning of a new age? I think that's going a little bit too far based on the evidence that we've seen. I can't rule it out. I mean, I myself said in my opening remarks that Latinos could turn out to be the Italians of the 21st century. And, in the closing minutes, I will make a remark that may prove to be controversial. And I've spent a lot of time thinking about whether I should make it. In the United States, if you ask what the term white means, I can find only one answer to that question. It means not black. And so immigrant groups other than, immigrant groups then have to figure out how to situate themselves in that great American binary. And most of them have chosen, not the black pole of the binary, but the other. And over time, there have been interesting books, written on the question of how Hungarians and Slavs and others, quote, became white when they were not so regarded when they first came to our shores. This is a complex and controversial argument. As I said, I hesitated even to put it on the table, but I don't rule out the possibility that in the next generation, Latinos as a largely a constructed category will melt into the rest of the population. I think that's more likely to happen than not. And what that means for our politics and culture in the long run is hard to gauge with any certainty, but it will be significant.
From a Democratic perspective, I think whites get a bad rap for their support of the Democratic Party. The idea that every white person votes Republican is absurd. You look at the states that are overwhelmingly white and look at how many of them give their electoral votes to the Democratic Party. Washington, Oregon, Minnesota, Maine, New Hampshire, one state after another. It's not as if this picture is completely clear. This is, but yet we get the picture from those who write on this that all American whites are prejudiced against blacks. The notion of this is so absurd as to defy logic. The way whites often act against or in contrary to Black action is in states where there's a lot of Blacks. But it's not true that the whites are a group that are opposed to Black action. This is just another example. I read today also when it comes to Hispanics or Latinos, if you want to call them this, that the concern of that some are developing, the problem is not Latino. Latinos like everyone else. Americans are one thing, Latinos are another, all sorts of countries, all sorts of different people. But now the distinction is being drawn to introduce the race question into everything, that the real problem is that white Latinos are moving towards white Americans. Black Latinos or mestizo men should join the group of the poor and the ones who aren't included in the American mainstream. In other words, to take the issue and make the racial model figure into the Latino view of the future. So another extension, you could say, of our emphasis upon racial politics.
Yeah, well, all I can say, Jim, is that in my opening statement, I was very careful to make the point that that race is not destiny in voting patterns, and I pointed to the very significant gains that the Biden campaign had made over the Clinton campaign in reaching out to what might be called the middle of white America, and doing that without really significantly sacrificing its appeal to the groups, other groups in America. So you won't get an argument out of me, and so I assume that you were arguing with someone else.
I'm arguing with everyone on the campus of the University of Virginia.
But I don't want to just let that statement that he deserves credit for representing all these people. It sort of matters how you represent people, and whether if they get their representation by shouting "lock them up" and by engaging and by total disdain for their fellow Americans by ethnic groups often, and for hating all kinds of elites and I guess resenting people who've done well in America. I'm not so sure that that's great to find. They've got representation. They've been populists through the ages and demagogues through the ages who've given people representation. We should have a higher standard than that. Gretchen Whitmer got elected by people in Michigan. She represents Michigan as much as Donald Trump does. And the notion that somehow Donald Trump represents it more, because why? Because he doesn't get Black votes and Gretchen Whitmer does? Because Gretchen Whitmer thinks that maybe she should, as governor of a state that's kind of complicated with Detroit and Grand Rapids and upstate, she should try not to increase racial tensions and play off one group against another, that makes her less of a spokeswoman in her case for middle America. I just don't buy that. So I think Trump has done a lot of damage there. And I think you can see it. Ohio had a Republican governor and Republican legislature. Michigan had a Republican governor and Republican legislature. They did some pretty good things, actually. The states were getting better, pretty well governed, I would say. And now they have Democratic governors. So,
and interestingly, the aforementioned Republican governor of Michigan endorsed Joe Biden for president. One of 8 former Republican governors to do so, the record will show.
We have one more question left because we started a bit late, which is by Tom Cleveland of the Jack Miller Institute. And he says, in Nature and History in American Political Development, Jim's book, Jim Caesar argued that the Republican Party is the party of natural right. Claremont types sometimes argue in these terms about Donald Trump himself. Is that the best way to understand the Republican Party today? Is there some better way to understand it? This goes to all of you. Jim, you go first.
Yeah, well, obviously, I have a great sympathy for this principle of natural rights. But I think what we've come to understand in looking at this is natural rights without being set within a context of what the culture is a dead end kind of argument. One has to consider both natural rights and the culture of a country. And to say that natural rights trumps, overcomes all cultural considerations, I think goes to excess. And maybe one of the things we've learned is the importance of putting the emphasis on the nation, the idea of what the people are, their traditions and their hopes. I'm not saying this is contrary to natural rights, but I think it's another dimension. I've come to be much more attuned to the previous views of the National Review on this view, that merely to speak of natural rights is not sufficient. One must speak of natural rights in a context, a much larger context. I think that actually protects natural rights where they're situated, and natural rights are situated in countries, and countries need certain things to survive besides just preaching natural rights. They have to understand what's distinct from themselves. This is why I don't believe we're under any obligation to have immigration. I'm for a good deal of immigration, but we're under no obligation to open the gates of the United States in this point in time. It all depends what's good for building the esprit of the nation in which natural rights can have its situated role.
I mean, it's such a big question, but I think what Jim said in the book, as I recall, is that natural right. It was the party of natural right somehow, which which I don't know what that would mean exactly. But look, obviously, any sensible person, and I think believe that sensible Democrats, who include an awful lot of veterans and people who've served the nation and his family have, understand that the nation matters and service matters, and everything can't be reduced to rights, or even to rights as kind of a formulaic version of rights and responsibilities. I just think now culture, history, tradition is being thrown around, as it has often in American history, if we can just be honest about the lost cause rhetoric and so forth, to cover up an awful lot of, to make it hard to question and have an actual discussion about actual policies and changes that are needed. And I'm hostile to that. And it also has covered up and also invited a lot of illiberalism, not in Jim's case, but certainly it is now respectable. And this is a product of not of Trump, but of the rationalizing of Trumpism, of Trump and Trumpism. It is now respectable, very respectable, to be a, proud illiberal, I would say, and to really have contempt for those stupid liberal views about rights and freedoms. And, if we need to have if we don't all agree immediately on a common good, we're just a soulless, technocratic, liberal society. All the Tocquevillian and Burkean side of conservatism has just been suppressed when it was quite strong 20 or 30 or 40 years ago. Many, many people were trying to think through what is the right Tocquevillian way to think about mixing a respect for traditions, a Federalist 49 type, to use Jim's favorite paper, even veneration perhaps for the Constitution, with an actual willingness to adjust to the times and to deal with the actual problems ahead and to fix injustices that are real injustices. And I guess I've moved in the opposite direction. I am not willing to think that it is a good idea to tolerate illiberalism, because aspects of liberalism, need to be modified and corrected and improved. I certainly believe the latter. That's entirely what, the Burke, Tocqueville, et cetera, tradition is all about. But it's too dangerous after the 20th century, I think, to give illiberalism a pass. And that is what the rationalizers of Trump have done. And you can start off with, it's just a rally and they're just chanting, and how many people is he really locked up, and he says these things, but he doesn't follow through on them. But you can be in a very different place very quickly. And I think it's worth really having I'm willing to tolerate aspects of liberalism I don't like for the sake of not letting illiberalism grow up on the right. It's bad enough where it exists on the left. We've all been very attuned to that, I think. But now it's, I think, quite strong. And it's been sort of normalized by Trump among this public that he represents so much. And people now say things that they wouldn't have thought of saying 5 or 6 or 10 years ago about their fellow Americans in ways that I think are dangerous.
Well, I'd say that the threat to liberalism and what liberal rights are comes far more from the left than from the right. When you get down to it and you look what's happening across the country at the university level, you see a systematic denial of the importance of liberal values. in our understanding of history, in our conduct of speeches for others, and then taking this from the university out into the streets, where there's armed mobs. I know that there's militias on the right as well. I don't deny that, but there's armed mobs coming from the left, which are openly disdainful of liberalism. And this is characterized, as I see it, the nature of American politics over the last year: relentless attacks on liberalism from the left.
Well, thanks very much. This has been an excellent discussion. I think remarkable both for its intelligence and for its diversity. Thank you for coming.
Thank you all.
Thank you.
Thank you all.